Okay, well, it's good to have everybody here on campus at HST for our ministry connection. And I know we have a number of people also who are joining us via Zoom conference. Before we get started today, we did ask Tim Westbrook is going to come and share a few words with us about Equip, a program at Harding University. So Tim, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, and then we'll get to, I'll introduce Jimmy Hinton.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Powell, for the opportunity to say a few words about Equip at Harding University. Some of you may be familiar with the longstanding preacher training programs that we've had at the undergraduate level at Harding. The old name CCP, HSBS, CAMT. We might even have some graduates from those programs on the call today. The latest version of that model is now what we call Equip at Harding University. We are providing undergraduate Bible degrees for students on campus and online, or a mixture of the two. And I just want to make sure that this community knows about that, because if you happen to know somebody who might be interested in pursuing their undergraduate Bible degree, maybe in preparation to attend HST or just to complete their undergraduate degree itself, please have them contact us. Our website is www.harding.edu/equip, and you can find all the information there. One more thing I want to mention to you is that we also have what we're calling our Ministry Scholarship, Ministry Scholarship, and that provides for anybody in the United States who wants to take one class online for free. You can go to our website, fill out that scholarship, and take one class for free per semester. I don't know how long that scholarship is going to last, but it is there for you for this summer if you're thinking about taking a free class for this summer. So feel free to check us out at Harding, Equip at Harding University, and I would love to talk with you more about it. Thank you, Dr. Powell, for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Tim. All right, we're excited to have Jimmy Hinton with us for a second week, and I was just talking to Frank Bowling here, who had just watched the first video before coming, and we appreciate last month when you shared with us about how abusers routinely get away with abusing victims in front of our eyes. Today, Jimmy's going to share with us about why the church regularly produces more victims than any other organization. A few things by way of biography. So Jimmy is a 2007 MDiv graduate from Harding School of Theology. He is now the full-time minister at the Somerset Church of Christ in Somerset, Pennsylvania. And I will promote his book, The Devil Inside, How my minister father molested kids in our home and church for decades, and how I finally stopped him. Jimmy has become an expert in helping churches prevent sexual abuse, and so we're really excited to have you joining us again today. So without further ado, Jimmy, we're going to pass it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Powell. Thank you again for having me and allowing me to talk about this difficult subject. Today, we're going to talk about how the church, or why the church routinely and regularly produces more victims than any other organization. I'm not proud of that claim, but we're seeing this over and over and over, and it's not just the church. I don't want to just pick on the church. This happens all over the place, but the bigger question is, what are we going to do about it? And before I kind of springboard into this topic of the church and kind of the church's response to that, I want to say what really haunted me when I reported my dad. That was back in 2011. What really haunted me was the fact that we all missed it. More than anything else, I lost sleep over the fact that he was doing this for over 40 years of his life, and we did not have a clue. And so I started researching this and researching abuse and abusers' techniques and all this stuff to try to make sense of that. And of course, the big question that I had, and I read about this in my book, but the big, I guess, theological question that I had is, where were you, God? When all these things were happening to all of these innocent children, and you could have stopped that. You could have arrested my dad's heart. You could have found a million different ways to stop him from hurting all of these victims. Where were you? And the answer that I got back from God was, you're asking the wrong question. The question is not, where was I? The question is, where were my people? And that question really changed the course of my life forever. I mean, there was no turning back once I had that aha moment. And I thought about this, where are God's people when all of this abuse is going on? I've spoken with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of victims all over the country, and almost inevitably their responses can be so scripted that they're almost identical verbatim. And that is that the harm done to us by the church was far worse than any of the abuse that we ever endured. And if you stop and think about that statement for a minute, that's incredibly troubling, because I know what abusers do to their victims. And I can't, in my wildest nightmares, imagine any human being capable of doing the things that they do to their victims. And yet this happens routinely over and over and over again. And for the church's response to be worse or more harmful to the victim than the abuse itself means that we have a long way to go in the church and how we respond to abuse. And I'll talk more about that in next month in the final session for how we respond to survivors. But I'm going to share my screen here for a while. And Matt's going to have to enable that because right now it's saying that I cannot share my screen. So maybe in the comments, just give a thumbs up whenever I'm able to do that. Let me go back here for a second. And there we go. Now I'm able to. So I'm going to have to blow this up a little bit. So just give me 1 second. I'm trying to juggle a couple different screens right now, and I'm not good at multitasking. Okay, so you guys should be able to see this. This is a slide, a snapshot, and this is compiled by Richard Hammer. He's an attorney, a very well-known attorney, and he puts this chart out routinely. He's been doing this for decades, and he shows what the top 5 reasons are for churches that end up in court. And almost always, over the past 20 plus years, the number one reason is sexual abuse of a minor, and how churches have mishandled it. I think 2021 was the first year that property disputes took place for number 1. I'll be curious to see at the end of 2022. I'll bet you that sexual abuse of a minor bumps right back up into first place again. This is a big problem, and this shows us that the church does not respond well to abuse. And I'm going to talk to you guys about an analogy that I use. Maybe this is because I grew up in Shanksville where Flight 93 crashed, but I have this, I don't want to call it an obsession, but awareness of plane crashes and what all happens. And Flight 93 in 2001 was not the first time that we had a tragic plane crash here in Pennsylvania, very close to my home. In 1994, US Air 427 crashed just a couple miles from the Pittsburgh airport. It was on final descent. It was a Boeing 737 3B7. All 132 people died on board. It was coming in. It was at about 2,000 feet. And the plane suddenly rolled to the right, rolled to the left, and then it rolled back over. And then it went into an uncontrolled descent and hit the ground. All people on board died. This is what was known as, in the investigation, it was called a rudder hardover. What happened was the hydraulic system was a really bad system. It didn't have redundancies built into it. And so the rudder controls were pretty hard rudder controls because they were getting into some wake turbulence. And the fluid actually pushed too hard to the one side, and it kind of reversed course. And the hydraulic fluid started to come back, giving the rudder an opposite effect than what the input was given. That was investigated. They found that out. They fixed that problem very quickly. And every single airplane that's produced since 1994 has these redundancies built into it, so that a rudder hardover will never happen again. And to my knowledge, it never has. Some of you may not be aware, but in 2001, just 2 months and 1 day after the terror attacks in New York City, Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania happened, there was a flight, American Airlines 587, that crashed in New York City. It took off from JFK. Right after departure, it went into an uncontrolled descent. All 265 people, well, there were 260 on board and 5 on the ground. All of those people died. It was an Airbus A330. And what happened was, in the investigation, they found that there was a separation of vertical stabilizer due to over-aggressive inputs by First Officer Sten Mullen. They got into wake turbulence, same kind of scenario as the other flight. Sten Mullen was improperly trained by American Airlines, and they were taught to put full rudder inputs whenever they got into severe wake turbulence. That's exactly what Sten Mullen did. He did exactly what he was trained to do. It put 2.5 times the force that was allowed to be put on the stabilizer, and it snapped it. It actually sheared the stabilizer off, and then the plane spiraled to the ground. A lot of us don't remember that crash, but that was the second most deadly plane crash in the United States. And then more recently, you guys will remember this, Lion Air 610, October 29th, 2018. This was the brand new, or 4-month-old 737 MAX 8. All 189 people died. It crashed just 12 minutes into takeoff from Indonesia. Much to everybody's surprise, a few months later, Ethiopian Air 302 crashed, another 4-month-old 737 MAX 8, brand new airplane. It crashed March 10th, 2019, 157 people died, and it crashed only 6 minutes after takeoff. What's fascinating about this is the response by the FAA. Immediately, they shut down every single MAX 8 and MAX 9. They grounded every single one of them in the world. There was a great cost to Boeing. There was $600 million in unfulfilled orders for Boeing. This gentleman from Indonesia, he said, our passengers had lost confidence to fly with the MAX 8. It wasn't just them, it was customers all over the world had lost confidence in the MAX 8. By March 23rd, 2019, Boeing stock had dropped 18%, or $40 billion. On April 8th, 2019, Bank of America downgraded Boeing stock. There were multiple ongoing lawsuits by family members and shareholders. My point is this, that the FAA, they stopped every single airplane in the world. Every MAX 8 and MAX 9, they stopped. They grounded them indefinitely until the investigation could run its course and they could figure out what happened. Why? Well, because people were dying. And air travel is supposed to be safe. Now, I use this as an analogy for the church, because I asked people, what would happen if the church's response to victims being abused actually caused this kind of an effect, where we said, you know what, we need to investigate this, and we're going to stop all church services until we figure out what's going on. Now, you might say, well, that's a little bit dramatic, isn't it? Well, look at COVID-19 at what happened. Literally, the whole country shut down, including churches. Probably 90+% of you live in states where churches had to stop meeting in person, at least for a few weeks. Our country shut down when there was an unknown virus and people were dying, and we didn't know how to respond to it. The course of actions, we may or may not agree with them. That's not really what I'm here to debate, but the point is this: we shut things down until we could start figuring out more about this disease and how to respond to it. We don't do this with sexual abuse. In fact, in the church, there are millions of survivors of sexual abuse. Every few years, millions of victims are produced. In fact, nationwide, about 3 million new victims of abuse, minor children, 3 million cases of abuse arise every single year, just in the United States. That's beyond pandemic levels, beyond. And yet, we're in this state of denial in the church. In fact, not only denial, but full-on cover-ups, where we go out of our way to cover up abuse. And I'll talk about why that's the case and what we do about it here in a little bit. But here in Pennsylvania, where we had the Jerry Sandusky scandal at Penn State back in 2011, 2012, we initiated all kinds of laws. There were mandated trainings for mandated reporters. We have, in the state of Pennsylvania, every single youth serving organization, including churches, we have to go through training. We have to all have background checks. There are no exceptions to this. There were very severe laws, very strict laws that were enacted after the Jerry Sandusky scandal at Penn State. However, child abuse, this is an article here in Pennsylvania. This was from 2016, the latter part of 2016. It says child abuse, including sexual abuse, is on the rise in PA, state data shows. I'm a nerd, and I like to read. I like to go to the governor's report, and I read their report on child abuse. They put an annual report out, and each year I look at that annual report, and the numbers keep going up. Why is that? What's going on? Are we getting worse at detecting abuse? Are we just reporting more abuse, or what's going on? My theory is that sexual abuse is such a monster that it takes a sea of people. It takes all hands on deck to tackle this problem. And we're not doing it. We're not doing it efficiently. We're not doing it effectively. We're not doing it consistently. And so abuse keeps happening more and more and more. This isn't just in Pennsylvania. This is happening in almost all 50 states. The numbers are going in the wrong direction. In 2019, I was the keynote speaker for Governor Kelly in Kansas. And she she actually introduced me by saying that the numbers in Kansas are actually spiraling out of control, that abuse is getting much worse in the state of Kansas, and each year it's getting worse and worse and worse. And her point was, we need to do something about this. We need to figure it out. We need to stop everything and find out why the numbers are getting worse and not getting better. This was an article by Joshua Pease in the Washington Post in 2018. Excellent article. I put the link to it here, but you can write the title down. The title of the article is "The Sin of Silence: The Epidemic of Denial About Sexual Abuse in the Evangelical Church." Here's what Josh says. He said, "Without a centralized theological body, evangelical policies and cultures vary radically. And while some church leaders have worked to prevent abuse and harassment, many have not. The causes are manifold: authoritarian leadership, twisted theology, institutional protection, obliviousness about the problem, and perhaps the most shocking, a diminishment of the trauma sexual abuse creates, especially surprising in a church culture that believes strongly in the sanctity of sex." And then my good friend Boz Tchividjian, grandson of Billy Graham and former Florida assistant state attorney, he says this: "Sexual abuse is the most underreported thing both in and outside the church that exists." Wrap your minds around that statement for a minute. I'll say it again. Sexual abuse is the most underreported thing both in and outside the church that exists, period. That is frightening. That's incredibly frightening to me. I'm going to stop sharing this just for a second. I want to talk about something that Joshua Pease wrote in that article. He interviewed Rachel Denhollander, who many of you might know from the Larry Nassar case with USA Gymnastics. Rachel, in this article that I just mentioned, Rachel talked about how she was sexually abused as a kid, not only by Larry, but by other people as well. And she mentioned this college student who went to their church. And this guy was kind of putting off some creepy vibes. And her parents took notice, and so did somebody else who was a church member, and she was a clinical psychologist. Uh, this church member approached Rachel's parents, and she said, "Look, this guy is putting off all these red flags. Um, you know, it's not looking good. This guy probably is a threat." And so Rachel's parents kind of talked to people in their home Bible study, and they were like, "What do you guys think about this? This is what this lady said. We don't really know how to respond to that." And so Joshua Pease wrote in this article that the overwhelming response from the group was Rachel's parents were overreacting. In fact, one of the parents who were attending their home Bible study said that their children were no longer allowed to play with Rachel because they were afraid that Rachel's parents would accuse them of sexual abuse. Well, it turns out that this college kid was abusing victims, and that included Rachel at that Bible study. He sat her in his lap like he typically did, and with the whole group there, he masturbated with Rachel sitting in his lap. Joshua wrote about that in the article. Rachel talked very openly about that. This stuff happens routinely all the time. So what was the problem? The problem was that we Christians are kind of geared to say, well, we're probably overreacting. What if I ruin somebody's life by giving a false accusation? What if I'm wrong? And so we start doubting ourselves, and we bypass that intuition that says something's not right here. And that happens all the time in the church. So I'm going to talk about ways that we can get around that. I'm going to go back to my screen here. There we go. So why is the church a hotbed for abuse? Here's some reasons that I came up with, and I think there's certainly more, but I think these are some of the main reasons. Number one at the top of the list is that bad theologies protect abusers and ignore victims. We have these bad theologies that say, oh my goodness, this person has fallen from grace, or they've stumbled, or they got quote unquote caught up in sin. How do we help this brother out? When I began consulting with churches, I really started about 9 years ago consulting with churches. Hands down, the number one question that I still get asked, this is in 9 years of doing this, the number one question that I get asked by church leaders when there's a credible allegation of abuse is, how do we surround this brother, and how do we support him? It still blows my mind that that's the first thing that comes to their mind. Not, what do we do for the victims? What do we do to ensure that they're never harmed again? What do we do to separate them from the alleged perpetrator? That's not what's on their mind. What's on their mind is, what do we do for this brother, this poor guy who has these allegations? How do we surround him and create these support groups and prayer groups? And you'd be surprised at the bizarre things that churches do for alleged abusers. So this is all rooted in bad theology. I always say bad theology leads to bad practices. I think another thing that got us to this point is prioritizing forgiveness above repentance. When our first response is to tell a victim that they need to forgive the perpetrator, rather than telling the perpetrator they need to knock it off, they need to repent. When we prioritize forgiveness above repentance, we enable abusers to continue doing what they're doing. And I think that's part of why abusers have so many victims. On average, the average pedophile, that is somebody who sexually abuses prepubescent children, the average pedophile has 150 plus victims before the time that they ever get caught, if they ever get caught. That's 150 individuals. That's not times that they abused. That's number of victims. That is, I mean, that's more than double the size of my congregation. And that's just one person. And so if you think about how many lives are dramatically affected forever by just by one abuser, it doesn't make sense for us to prioritize forgiveness above repentance. Another thing is a gross lack of training to recognize abuse patterns and understanding that we are mandated reporters. In nearly 50 states, clergy and really people in an official role at a church are considered mandated reporters. That means if there's a credible allegation of abuse, not that abuse did happen, but that abuse could have happened, whether at the church building or not, we are mandated to report that if that victim is a minor. So if the victim is a minor, we don't have a choice. In fact, it's illegal to not report. We're seeing this with the news coming out of Midland, Texas, Midland Christian School. There were 5 officials who were arrested, and then 4 others from another Christian school in Midland shortly after that. 9 people arrested in Midland for failure to report. They were arrested because it is illegal not to report. If you're a mandated reporter and there's a credible allegation of abuse, you must report. Most church leaders don't know that they're mandated reporters, or they'll find ways around it and come up with excuses to not report. Another reason is a lack of and inadequate child protection policies. We didn't have a child protection policy until we found out about my dad. It wasn't even on our radar. So this is not a criticism. It's just a fact of where many, many, many churches are. I think I remember seeing a statistic that 80% of our church membership is made up of churches of about 100 members or less. So if you think about that, the vast majority of those small churches typically don't have the best equipping for coming up with good reports. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the budgets, or it's just not on their radar. And so my suspicion is that the majority of our churches don't even have they don't even have a child protection policy in the first place. For the ones that do, a lot of them are really, really inadequate. And a lot of churches don't even know what's in their protection policies. Another reason is authoritarian leadership models where elders or leaders hold all of the decision-making power. And where I see this play out is that church leaders have the right to be in the know, and they also have the power to keep everybody else in the dark. That's a dangerous, toxic model when you introduce abuse into the church. It may work, it may work well for 95% of the things that churches do, but when you introduce abuse into the situation, these models are extremely toxic, because typically what happens is the church leaders have this culture of secrecy, which is the next point. They create this culture of secrecy where the churches are not informed when credible threats are present. In other words, the leaders say, we're going to handle this in-house. We'll take care of it. We'll figure this out. A lot of times they don't know what they're doing just because they've not had experience with it. And so they're making decisions based on ignorance, just not knowing, but they're also hiding that information from the rest of the church. And they're not tapping people within the congregation who could really help them make informed decisions. And then finally, there are these dangerous covenant agreements between abusers, known abusers, typically registered sex offenders. This is an agreement between them and the church leaders, and they're designed to keep abusers in the church. And I should have put this as a side note. They're also intended to keep this, to keep the identity of the abuser private and confidential. And so the church, 90% of the time, doesn't even know that they have registered sex offenders in the church. Abuse basically gets put on steroids at this point. I cannot overstate how much this enables abusers, whether they spent time in prison or not. This really empowers abusers. And so what do we do about it? What does the church do about it? Here are some steps that I think are really critical, and there are 10 of these here. And again, I could come up with a lot more of these, but I think these are 10 that are really important. Number one, we need to embrace a theology that is rooted in righteousness and justice. That is the foundation of God. Psalm 89:14. Righteousness and justice are God's foundation, and steadfast love and faithfulness flow from it. I'm not going to ask you guys this because I just gave you the answer, but typically when I do a training at a church, I'll ask them what God's foundation is. And the reason this is important is because with anything, whether it's a building structure, whether it's our faith, whether it's the churches that we build, foundations are critical, because if we get the foundation wrong, it doesn't matter what we build on top of that. It doesn't matter how strong it is. It doesn't matter how beautiful it is. It doesn't matter how magnificent it is. If we build something on a faulty foundation, it will eventually crumble, period. And so foundations are absolutely critical. And I'll ask churches when I do trainings, what is God's foundation? Because if we don't even know that, then we're in serious trouble. And guys, I have never had a church answer this right. Not once. And so that tells me that we have this problem that is quite literally a foundational problem. We're building policies, we're building cultures, we're building theologies on a faulty foundation. We don't even know what God's foundation is. And I've heard people say, well, God's foundation is love, or God's foundation is mercy. God's foundation is forgiveness. I've heard all of those answers, and those are all wrong. God's foundation is righteousness and justice, doing what's right and balanced, not tipping the scales. That word in Hebrew means not tipping the scales for somebody. It was used in the marketplace, and it means we begin with balanced scales. And then justice is meting out what's owed somebody, good or bad. It's making a judgment. And so that righteousness is really important, because I see people tipping the scales all the time. And I think that's why we have such an epidemic in the church. And I once had a church minister. I was consulting with the church, and one of their shepherds was involved in all kinds of cover-ups and just crazy stuff. It was reportable. It was most definitely 100% reportable. And I told them that. I said, you guys absolutely have to make a report to the police. And the minister told me, he said, I've known this man most of my life. We're best friends. He's a peer. He's a mentor. He said, we are close friends. And he said, if I do what you're asking me to do, I run the risk not only of losing a friend, but of being fired from my position. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have come back so forcefully, but that just kind of ignited something inside of me. And I said, I don't know if you're familiar with my story, but I said, I'm really the wrong person to be making that argument with, that you're not going to report because you're friends with this guy, or you might lose your job. And I said, Jesus told us to lay down our lives for innocent people. And I said, you're not even willing to lay your job down. And this is typically the response. That's tipping the scale in favor of somebody and tipping the scale against somebody else. You're beginning with imbalanced scales. Number two, we need to get well trained to identify signs of abuse and know when and how to report. That's not the purpose of this training, but I will share with you guys 3 takeaways that I give churches, that if I could boil my trainings down to just these 3 simple things, we would eliminate a lot of abuse in the church. But before I get to that, I'll run through these websites here. To get well trained, G.R.A.C.E, the organization that was mentioned before, that Boz Chividjian founded back several years ago, the website is netgrace.org. I actually am one of their safeguarding specialists. There are 3 of us that do trainings all over the country, and it is an excellent training program. I mean, really good. I also do trainings. It's quite a bit different from G.R.A.C.E's. G.R.A.C.E's is pretty heavy in theology. Mine is probably more rooted, I would say, in understanding techniques of abusers and how we recognize those. Also, another good organization is another HST grad, Christine Fox Parker, porchswingministries.org. She does excellent work. Her and I, we collaborate a lot, and she really understands dynamics of abusers and what it takes for churches to be safe places, and especially for survivors of abuse, how to care for them and nurture them in the church. Another one is Darkness to Light. The website is d2l.org. They have a really good, pretty solid training program. And I think they have an online course that you can do as well. I think there's a free online course that you can take. That's just kind of an introductory course that will get your feet wet. I lost my train of thought. Now I forget what I was going to tell you. This is what happens when I kind of plow through. We'll circle back to that. You guys can ask that in the Q&A section. Oh, the 3 takeaways. Sorry, I remembered now. If I were to boil my trainings down and give you 3 takeaways, again, my specialty is understanding abuse in plain sight. If you were to look out for quote unquote signs that abuse might be happening and actually have some tangible that you can do starting today, I mean right now, right, literally in the next 5 minutes, here's a takeaway that I would give you guys. Always be alert, always be vigilant, and watch. Here's what you watch for. Number 1, watch people's eyes. Number 2, listen to their words. And number 3, watch their hands. Well, what do I mean by that? Watch the eyes. Watch how people look at other people. I talk about this a lot, especially with females. Females know, they understand what a pervert who's Googling them looks like. I don't mean Google searches. I mean the googly eyes. They're checking them out in a sexual way. Every female that I've ever spoken to knows what that looks like, feels like. You cannot mistake that look. When you go to the shopping mall, all of us can pick out somebody who's a perverted person who's checking out teenage girls or even adult women walking by. You cannot mistake that look. That same look applies to pedophiles. They look at that. It's like they get lost in time and they forget that there's a world around them, and they just get kind of roped into that zone where they're just, I mean, they're staring. The reason that we don't see that with prepubescent children is because we're not expecting to see it. So that same look is there. That same look of the guy sitting at, think the guy sitting at the shopping mall. That same look is the same look that pedophiles give all the way down to infant children. Look at the way people are looking at other people and know how to interpret that. Watch the eyes. If somebody tips you off, if you're like, oh my goodness, like this guy cannot take his eyes off of the youth group and he's just staring at these kids and you know, something's not right here. Then I tell people to listen to the words, listen to what they're saying. Are they making crude jokes? Are they making comments about their looks, about you look so pretty, you look so gorgeous, your hair is so beautiful, your eyes, your smile, oh my goodness, you're going to be a catch when you're older, you're going to be a little heartbreaker? Are they making inappropriate comments? If that's the case, then this guy should be very high on your radar. I mean, really, really high on your radar. And then watch the hands. That includes all 10 fingers at all times. Abuse cannot take place. Physical abuse cannot take place. Sexual abuse physically cannot take place without somebody using their hands and their fingers. So always watch where people's hands are. Okay, the next point, churches must have a written policy. They have to have a written protection policy, period. There are no exceptions to this. I would recommend the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide for Churches and Ministries. This is again, by Boz Chivijan and Shira Berkovitz. This book is excellent, excellent, excellent. Every single church ought to have multiple copies of this on their shelf. This is a policy guide that teaches you how to build a policy from the ground up, or to take an existing policy and to make it stronger. The next point, when allegations arise, you need to call on experts to navigate. This is not one of the things that you want to be flying by the seat of your pants and be like, well, we'll figure it out. I can promise you that even the most well-intended people, even the wisest people, will get it wrong about 90% of the time, for all the previous mentioned reasons. Our theology gets in the way, our cultures get in the way. There's just a host of reasons why we get this wrong. Call on experts to help you navigate. There are plenty of us out there who do consulting. We do online consulting. There are plenty of professionals out there who can help you navigate. This is a must, must, must. The next point, we can consider a third-party investigation if no criminal investigation can take place. So this will be where you call in a third-party investigator to look at whether there are more victims within the church, or whether there's a culture of cover-up, or they can just kind of assess what went wrong, what went right, and they'll always give a list of recommendations after this investigation is complete. Again, this is not a criminal investigation. This is a third-party investigation, and they will give a list of recommendations for the church. One of the best places that does these investigations is G.R.A.C.E. They have an incredible investigative team. I've actually worked with them on several cases, and they are absolutely top-notch. We need to create a transparent culture where abusers are named by name to the congregation. This is not unfair. This is not unjust. This is not gossipy. This is for the protection of innocent people. This is not people who might have abused. I'm not suggesting that. I'm not recommending that. These are people who are known abusers, typically registered sex offenders, or there were credible allegations of abuse. We need to name them by name and tell the congregation, this is what this person did. They are a threat. They will always be a threat. And we know that because they actually followed through and they abused victims. We need to take swift action when credible allegations of abuse arise. I've had churches say to victims, well, we have to have a meeting, and our next meeting is next month. And after that meeting, we have a follow-up meeting. And before you know it, 6, 8, 10 months has passed by and nothing ever happened. Whenever there's a credible allegation of abuse, that's unacceptable. There has to be immediate and swift action when credible allegations arise. Number 9, we need to create a system where it's safe for victims to come forward and speak up. I can't tell you how many victims of abuse told me, we will never tell anybody anything again because we reported abuse and we were shut down so hard and treated so harshly and poorly that we don't trust anybody to talk to ever again. This has got to change within the church. We have to let people know, let the congregants know that it is safe to tell, and it's not going to fall on deaf ears, that we actually have a system in place through our written policy for what the next steps are going to be once a report is made. Once somebody discloses abuse, here are the steps that are going to be taken, and that's all spelled out in your written policy. This should not be guesswork. Victims should not have to second guess. They should not have to say, well, how are they going to take this? Are they going to be mad at me? Are they going to retaliate? Are they going to shut me down? Victims should not be asking those questions to themselves. They should know point blank and very crystal clear how the church will respond when they disclose abuse. And then finally, we need to preach about the evils of abuse and oppression from the pulpit. We need to very unapologetically let people know that abuse will never be tolerated in the church, ever. that God doesn't tolerate it, Jesus didn't tolerate it, and we're not going to tolerate it. So I'm going to stop with that because I want to give enough time for you guys to have Q&A. And again, this was not to teach you all the facets of abuse because it's just impossible. You cannot cram that into a short session. But hopefully these bullet points will help us to think differently about how we're going to respond, not if, but when allegations of abuse arise in your church, because it will happen.
Hey, thank you very much, Jimmy. That was really helpful and really well done.
Sure.
I want to remind everybody who may be watching on Zoom that we do have a chat feature that you can submit questions on chat. We also have some folks here in the room, so we'll just open it up to the Q&A.
Okay.
Jimmy, could you share some of those slides, some of those facts with us? Is that a possibility?
Sure.
Which
I'm not
Are you
sure.
talking about the statistics of abuse?
Well, no, for me, the last couple of ones, how do we identify, what do we do about it? Those last two lists.
You want them put back up again?
No, is there a way that you can send them? I guess I wasn't clear.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yep. I can send those to Dr. Powell, and then you can, I mean, I don't copyright anything of mine, so kind of an open source. Yeah, I'd be glad to share those.
I have a couple of questions that are coming to us from chat, so let me see if I can pull those up. We have from Keith Fussell, do you have examples of a written church policy? I think you, in those slides, mentioned one example of that, but he's asking if you have examples of a written church policy.
I do. Actually, on our church website, we have a policy that I use as a template for other churches. Our website is somersetchurchofchrist.com. And I've helped, actually collaborated some with Boz whenever he wrote his book on the child safeguarding or the policy guide book. We've worked together on policies and kind of the nuts and bolts, and what makes a good policy, what should be included, what shouldn't be included. So our policy is far from the best policy that's out there. It's not. I mean, there are plenty of policies out there that are fantastic. They're superb. But ours, I feel like is pretty strong, especially for our size congregation. Now, our policy wouldn't work well for a church of, say, 500 plus people, just because that culture completely changes. And, there's a lot that has to go into those policies that just wouldn't apply to us, and vice versa. But yeah, you can see the sample of our policy on our church website.
And I apologize for those of you who may be watching on Zoom. There's a Q&A feature. That's where you should be asking questions, not the chat feature, the Q&A feature. So we did have a couple questions about just examples of written policy. So you mentioned the one at your church. And then I think in the slides you had a book that gives you some resources.
Yes.
Let me read another question from one of our recent graduates. What are some resources out there for churches to employ in setting up a structure to handle abuse in our churches? So I think the question kind of goes along the lines of, yes, just kind of a structure for once there's an allegation, kind of the steps for dealing with that.
Yeah, that's all going to come through your written policy. Again, going back to Boz and Shira's book, they lay out what you write into your policy when there's an allegation of abuse, because obviously it's not like you're hitting the panic button. You're like, oh my goodness, like, what do we do? How do we figure this out? There are real clear indicators that say, there are even charts that'll tell you, like, this is reportable and this isn't. A lot of people don't know. I didn't know, what was considered a reportable incident and what wasn't. so that book really helps lay that out. I think that's probably the top resource for trying to figure that out. Also, their website, netgrace.org, they have a resource page on there where they have, I mean, lots of articles, scholarly articles, articles written by theologians. It is an excellent, excellent free place to find resources on these kinds of topics. I mean, there are a host of topics that are mentioned on that resource page. And I think, I've been to a lot of websites, and I think that's one of the best resource pages that I've found to date.
Any other questions here, or look on our Q&A? I will say personally, I've had some questions at times with the church I'm at here. And I know Christine, you mentioned Christine Parker has been a real helpful resource.
Yeah.
So some of those resources that you gave, I would never discourage, I always encourage people to contact Jimmy, contact Christine, or these other resources. Because a lot of times there's a lot of nuances or specific, odd situations. And but they have been, Christine has been very helpful for me and some of the questions I've had.
Yeah.
Let me see here. How about this? Let's say I'm not a church leader and I'm convicted by what you've said. What would you recommend as a first step to bringing this subject to the attention of church leadership?
This is a very tricky question. And the reason I hesitate is because we have such an inherent culture in the church generally, and this is across all denominations. We have an inherent culture that says you must approach the leaders first about anything. Whether that's a verbal policy or whether that's even real, it's definitely perceived. That notion is perceived among church members that our only option is to go and talk to church members. I've seen this more times than I can count on both hands and both feet. I've seen where people they've been convicted. They have incredibly good intentions. They're not church leaders. They'll approach church leaders and say, look, I want to put this on your radar. Like, we need to be talking about this. I would say that out of every 20 people who've gone to church leaders with conviction and said, let's at least start talking about this, I'd say that out of every 20, probably one out of those 20 had church leadership that actually said, you know what, like, let's talk about it. You're right. The other 19 were completely shut down or ignored, or, the can got kicked down the road. So I think probably one of the best ways to approach this is begin by talking with other parents, people who actually have kids. There's a vested interest in the church among these people to protect innocence, because their kids are those kids. A lot of church leaders, typically are older, or their kids are older, and so this isn't really on their radar. And that's not a black mark on the church leaders. It's just that it's not on their radar. And so you bringing it up and you being convicted about it, to them, leaders are already super busy. Leaders are typically overworked, underpaid, understaffed. So this is just one more thing on their plate. That's the way they're going to look at it. That doesn't mean that they don't care. It doesn't mean they're not compassionate. But the best way to put it on their radar is to get a group of people, and maybe even find people within that group where incidents have happened or where the kids were abused. Doesn't mean in that church. I'm not saying in that church, but I guarantee you take a sample of 10 parents, you're going to have almost half of those parents have kids that have already been abused. Just statistically speaking, and based on experience, you will have parents whose kids have been abused in your church. It doesn't matter if you're a church of 40 people or 40,000 people. You will find parents whose kids have been abused. So get those parents involved in that conversation, and then you guys talk and collaborate as a group and say, okay, how do we how do we approach the leadership? Because you guys are going to know your leadership better than me. And so, you're going to find probably the best ways to approach them as a group and say, we really, really, really need to talk about this, and we should probably begin the stages of getting a written policy in place.
Okay, well, it's about that time, 12:55. I know we have a couple folks here who might have to get to class. And so, Jimmy, thank you. Again, this was very helpful. And I think
Absolutely.
some of the questions that you that I see on the chat, I think if people go back, we're going to have this video posted, and especially right there toward the end, some of those slides you had and some of the resources that you offered, I think will answer or help give people some resources. Some of those websites that you gave will give people resources for some of the questions that were being asked. Thank you, Jimmy. We look forward to hearing from you in about another month, Tuesday, April 12th.
Okay,
And
absolutely.
Jesus's model for loving and protecting the wounded.
Yep.
So
Awesome.
thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Powell.